America's most unhinged judges. You would have thought like a judge is someone who's probably taken a long time to get to that rank. They usually start off as lawyers and it takes a long time to sort of qualify. And, you'd think that a judge is going to be someone who takes their job super seriously, isn't going to kind of, flip out, get emotional. But I guess judges are human beings as well, because I think we're going to see some examples of just crazy people here.
Everyone knows a judge can sentence you to jail or give you a fine. But did you know that they have a ton of discretion to fashion a punishment to fit the crime? And much to Hester Prynne's dismay, they could force you to wear a scarlet letter, force you to listen to Barry Manilow, or make you live in a terrible apartment. For example, 20-year-old Diamond Gaston walked into a Burger King and pepper sprayed an employee. I guess they weren't serving it her way. And that eventually landed her in the courtroom of Ohio Municipal Judge Michael Cicconetti, where she was facing sentencing for assault charges. But Judge Cicconetti gave her a choice: 30 days in jail or allow her victim to pepper spray her in the face right then and there.
You know what? I like that. I like a bit of tit for tat, eye for an eye and all that.
And what followed was truly one of the most bizarre scenes in American justice history.
If you don't want to do 30 days in jail, which you'd be going right now, I'll allow Mr. Rolls to have his vengeance. And that is to give you a shot of pepper spray.
She got off easy. The judge made sure the spray was only filled with water.
Yes, that's right.
Oh, what? Boo.
Judge Cicconetti sentenced Gaston to be a subject of a courtroom prank of his own design. But this likely came as no surprise to anyone who follows his cases, as Judge Cicconetti achieved viral internet fame for his inventive criminal punishments. In another case, 3 men were caught attempting to solicit sex from an undercover cop posing as a prostitute, and
whoops.
Judge Cicconetti offered them a choice between jail time with a fine or standing on a street corner for 3 hours while holding signs that declared "No Chicken Ranch in Plainsville."
Very humiliating, very embarrassing.
Now, whether or not
At least they can't see who you are, to be fair.
the citizens of Plainsville, Ohio knew that this was a reference to the name of the brothel in the movie The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas is anyone's guess. But many of Judge Cicconnetti's punishments involve public shaming, which critics argue is a type of Scarlet Letter-style punishment that has no place in modern society. Judge Cicconetti, however, disagrees on the basis that the people in his court are always given the option to take a traditional sentence, and most of the time they choose whatever spectacle he dreams up instead.
This is it, like, the person chose to do it. They weren't forced to do it, so why should the judge get in trouble for this?
It's hard to argue that his sentences don't provoke a feeling of cosmic justice beyond the limitations of the justice system. In one such case, a woman abandoned 35 kittens in the woods in the middle of winter, 9 of whom perished. And the judge was set to give her the maximum sentence of 90 days in jail for domestic animal abuse. But the judge offered the woman a choice. Instead of 90 days in the slammer, she could serve 14 days in jail and give a $500 donation to the park rangers who found the kittens, pay $3,200 to the Humane Society, and spend 1 night alone in the woods.
So I told her that if you're going to let these kittens out in the woods, let's do the same to you. I want you to go out in the woods and spend the night alone, see how you like it.
And the woman took the deal. In his defense, Judge Cicconetti wants his criminal sentences to have a relationship to the crime, and his approach seems to be working.
I like it. What do you guys think? I think it's very fitting. What do they say? The punishment should fit the crime. I like it.
The national recidivism rate is around 75%, but in Judge Cicconnetti's courtroom, it's 10%.
Wow.
And apparently his creative sentences have won him the respect of his peers, who even elected him as president of the American Judges Association. But not everyone sees it this way. Attorney Lisa Bloom told Court TV, quote, "It can make light of the justice system. I don't see that it works. I see that it's demeaning to the defendant, possibly would deter them from committing those crimes."
Oh, cry me a river. There's always someone, oh, it's demeaning to the defendant. Don't commit crimes then. Like, if you don't want to be in a courtroom getting weird punishments, don't commit a crime. Like, it's pretty common sense, isn't it?
Crimes in the future, but I don't think it necessarily deters other people. Now, the Eighth Amendment specifically forbids cruel and unusual punishments, and while Eighth Amendment cases typically focus on the cruel aspect of the criminal punishment in question, we have yet to see any Supreme Court rulings on whether the wearing of a hideous chicken suit in public constitutes a violation of the constitutional rights, as unusual as that is. But would forcing a 21-year-old criminal defendant to marry his 19-year-old girlfriend constitute a cruel and unusual punishment?
What?
Well, in Texas, Judge Randall Rogers didn't think so, giving new meaning to the term life sentence. When police charged Justin Bundy with assault for punching his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend, the judge gave him a choice: marry your girlfriend or serve 15 days in jail.
What?
Faced with jail time and the risk of losing his job, Bundy opted for marriage. Judge Roberts also required Bundy to write a Bible verse 25 times per day, specifically Proverbs 26:27, quote, "If a man digs a pit, he will fall into it." Now, one would hope this Bible verse gave him second thoughts about marrying a teenager, but who's to say? As news of the unusual punishment spread, other couples came forward with their own tales of court-compelled marriage. Michelle Powell and her boyfriend were facing shoplifting charges.
I just don't understand the logic of asking him to marry his cousin. Like, there's no tie to the crime or anything, like, at least to my understanding. Like, what's that about?
After they failed to scan some products in the self-checkout line, at least that was their story. And during the first court appearance, Judge Rogers discovered the couple lived together, but they were not married. According to the transcripts, Judge Roberts proclaimed, quote, "If you get within 100 feet of him during the probation, you go to jail." But then he offered them an alleged reprieve. He said, quote, "Do you two want to run off and get married and come back?" The couple agreed to get hitched and the judge dismissed the charges. But I probably don't need to tell you this, forced marriage is legally problematic. The choice to marry is a personal decision central to individual freedom, and the Supreme Court recognizes marriage as a fundamental right protected under the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses of the 14th Amendment. So coercing someone into marriage infringes on the personal autonomy and is probably a violation of constitutional rights. But in the case of the first marriage, Bundy was terrified that he would lose his job if he was incarcerated and felt he had no choice but to take the deal. And while it's likely that Bundy would have won on appeal, the damage would have already been done.
Fair enough.
These sentences were also disturbing because Judge Rogers only encouraged marriage when the defendants didn't have lawyers. But at least the story has a
Yeah, that is odd. Maybe he knew that the lawyers would be like, what are you doing? You know, why are you making them get married? That is odd. That is weird.
Relatively happy ending. After the local news exposed Judge Rogers, the Freedom from Religion Foundation filed a complaint with the Texas State Commission on Judicial Conduct. Now, the SCJC rarely penalizes judges, but they formally sanctioned Judge Rogers. The commission's records are private, so we don't know if the commission reprimanded the judge for the Bible verse, the marriage punishment, or both. But regardless, it's safe to say, at least for the time being, that you can't force your deeply held religious beliefs about marriage onto subjects of your court. But what happens when a judge ignores the Constitution in their creative sentencing and both the defendant and the victims agree to it? Well, in 2011, 17-year-old Tyler Alfred from Oklahoma was charged with first-degree manslaughter after a DUI crash that killed his passenger. Although his blood alcohol content was below the adult legal limit of 0.08, Oklahoma's laws for underage drinking applied and thus warranted stricter sentencing. But that's when Judge Mike Norman got creative. Alfred was given a deferred sentence, meaning that he would serve no prison time so long as he followed rules set out by the judge.
No prison time for manslaughter?
Which included things like graduating high school, going to welding school, undergoing substance testing for 1 year, and attending church weekly for 10 years. You might not have caught that. Part of his sentence was to attend church weekly for 10 years.
Nah, man, I'm sorry. I don't think that's acceptable. Like, come on. Why is he getting, he got let off the hook. Like, someone's dead. Like, nah.
Violating his First Amendment freedom to practice or not practice religion. Now, the craziest thing about the sentence is that the judge agreed it was unconstitutional. Judge Norman said he had used the church sentence before, and while he agreed it was illegal, he would keep right on doing it. That's because the perpetrator and the victim were both happy with the sentence. Judge Norman said he didn't think anyone would challenge the sentence, and he was right. The defendants possess the clear right to challenge their sentences, as they are directly affected by the court's judgment, but Alfred was pleased with the sentence because he didn't have to spend time in prison. And victims have some limited standing to challenge criminal sentences, as we talked about in our video about Adnan Syed. But people who are not parties to criminal proceedings can't challenge the constitutionality of that sentence. But that doesn't mean that everyone thought it was a swell idea to violate the Constitution. The ACLU of Oklahoma did not have the right to appeal Alfred's sentence directly, so they filed a complaint to have the judge sanctioned. The complaint, submitted to the Oklahoma Council on Judicial Complaints, alleged that Judge Norman's mandate infringed upon the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses of the First Amendment, as well as similar provisions of the Oklahoma Constitution.
What do you guys think? Do you think, based on what we know about the perpetrator, like, do you think that punishment was fair and proper? I guess you could argue that because the victim, maybe their family thought it was okay, then I guess that's fine. But think of how many other people get sentenced to manslaughter and they get given like 20 years in prison.
The ACLU of Oklahoma's executive director, Ryan Kiesel, emphasized that the government cannot compel individuals to participate in religious activities, stating, quote, "It is shocking that a judge would so blatantly ignore the First Amendment, which at a minimum prevents the government from forcing church attendance and from interfering in deeply personal matters of faith." Now, despite the ACLU's complaint, there is no public record indicating that Judge Norman faced any formal sanctions or disciplinary actions from the Oklahoma Council on Judicial Complaints or any other judicial oversight body. But once again, the matter of judicial discipline might have been resolved behind closed doors. Now, obviously, if you're faced with a bizarre criminal punishment, you'll want a good lawyer. But if you want a great lawyer, let my law firm, the Eagle Team, help. Took a creative approach to in Fort Lupton, Colorado, municipal judge Paul Sacco took a creative approach to penalizing teenagers who violated local noise ordinances. He required offenders to spend an hour listening to music they might find unappealing, such as Barry Manilow's I Write the Songs, The Platters' Only You, Tony Orlando and Dawn's Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree, and the theme from Barney the Dinosaur. For YouTube reasons and ethical reasons, I will spare you from hearing any of those songs. But oh boy, an hour of this borders on cruel and unusual punishment.
Yeah, to be fair, could you imagine hearing like that Barney song for an hour straight? I love you, you love me. Could you? To be fair, I think I might go insane. Genuinely, I might lose it.
Now, Judge Sacco noticed that the offenders of the noise ordinance would simply show up to court, pay the fines, and more often than not, re-offend again. He thought that by subjecting offenders to music they disliked, they might better understand the discomfort they caused others by playing loud or disruptive music, telling reporters, quote, "Most kids don't want to hear someone like Glenn Close trying to sing opera." Now, once word spread about the noisy sentence, rowdy teams seem to have taken note. And according to Judge Sacco, none of the teenagers sentenced to forced Manilow re-offended. There's also some evidence that Judge Sacco might have become a Fanilo himself. Quote, "I actually
A Fanilo.
don't think Manilow's too bad." And in 2017, a judge in Hawaii took a similar path, but for a much more serious
Why is the gavel so big? Look at that. It's like a sledgehammer.
offense. A few weeks before his sentence, Darren Young was arrested for violating a restraining order when he sent 144 abusive text messages to his ex-girlfriend. But Judge Rhonda Liu sentenced Young to write 144 compliments about his ex-girlfriend, matching the number of offensive messages that he had sent. Additionally, she fined him $2,400, assigned him 200 hours of community service, and placed him on 2 years probation. Judge Liu wanted him to reflect on his behavior and change, stating, quote, "For every nasty thing you said about her, you're going to say a nice thing. No repeating words." And apparently it worked. Young expressed remorse during the sentencing, fulfilling the court-imposed obligations, and moved forward with his life.
This is the thing, like, as bizarre as a lot of these punishments are, if they work and they don't reoffend the perpetrator, I mean, if it works, right? Like, oh, yeah, I guess you can't really argue with it. Or what do you think?
Now, these approaches are examples of alternative sentencing aimed at rehabilitation and deterrence, and as goofy as they may sound, they touch on one of the biggest problems facing the criminal justice system, specifically the country's high rate of recidivism. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, approximately 68% of prisoners are rearrested within 3 years of release, and 83% are rearrested at least once within 10 years of release. And of course, prisons are overpopulated and overburdened. And so in recent years, courts are increasingly experimenting with creative sentences that emphasize restitution and rehabilitation over incarceration and strict adhesion to the sentencing guidelines. And that brings us to California, where federal judge Vaughn Walker was tasked to punish Sean Gementera for stealing letters from mailboxes. Gementera was found guilty for stealing 42 pieces of mail, including a U.S. Treasury check for $1,525, and had an extensive criminal history of similar offenses. Judge Walker sentenced him to 2 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, which included some unconventional conditions. The judge made Gementera stand for 8 hours outside of a San Francisco postal facility, wearing a signboard stating, quote, "I stole mail, this is my punishment." His other release conditions included observing patrons at a post office lost and found window, writing apology letters to his victims, and delivering lectures at local high schools about his crime and its consequences.
Wow. To be fair, I think that part would really be effective, like delivering those speeches, because, you know, you're standing there telling people that you did wrong. And then if you then do that thing again, you just look so stupid. So I think it'll work.
The federal judges have broad discretion in setting conditions of probation and release, and Judge Walker justified his creative punishment in this ruling, writing, quote, "There are people who depend on the integrity and security of the mail in very important ways, and that a crime of this kind that he committed abuses that trust which people place in the mail. How else can he be made to realize that then by coming face to face with people who use the postal service? That's the idea." And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the ruling 2-1. The judge also explained that Gementera refused to acknowledge the seriousness of the crime, and his punishment reflected the people's interest in him understanding that stealing mail is not a victimless crime. But unlike the cases presided over by Judge Cicconetti, who gave out similar public shaming punishments, Gementera was never given the public shaming punishment as an option, and so his attorneys argued on appeal that the court's creative sentence violated his Eighth Amendment rights. However, the appellate court ruled in favor of the judge and against the appeal, finding that since the signboard was reasonably related to the legitimate objectives laid out by Judge Walker, the sentence did not constitute cruel and unusual punishment.
And what's cruel and unusual about holding up a signboard? I mean, come on.
Now, dissenting Judge Michael Hawkins said there was no rehabilitation in public shaming, and he compared the sentence to the stocks and pillories of colonial America and the Scarlet Letter. The Supreme Court ultimately declined to take up the case, which means that humiliating signboard punishments are probably still legal. Now, banishment is a criminal punishment that's as old.
Again, it's another one of those where it's like, look at them crying over the punishment. What about just don't commit crime? Like, if you don't do the crime, you won't have to, do the punishment.
As civilization itself. And while modern law generally frowns on it, it seems that the state of Georgia never got the message. In 1994, Gregory Mac Terry pleaded guilty to aggravated stalking, aggravated assault, reckless driving, attempting to elude a police officer, passing within 200 feet of oncoming traffic, driving with a suspended license, and criminal trespass. The trial judge sentenced him to 30 years in prison. However, when the state finally granted his parole, the judge banished Terry from living in every Georgia county but one, Toombs County, a rural area more than 200 miles from Terry's home.
Okay, that's pretty crazy. Wow.
Terry
He's only allowed to live in that tiny little patch.
challenged his condition of probation on the basis that it violated the Georgia Constitution, which states, quote, "Neither banishment beyond the limits of the state nor whipping shall be allowed as a punishment for crime." Now that seems pretty clear. Banishment is unconstitutional, so banishment from 158 of 159 counties in Georgia is surely illegal, right? Wrong. The Georgia Supreme Court said that historically banishment is construed, quote, "narrowly to mean only banishment beyond the limits of the state." Now, Terry wasn't technically banished from the state of Georgia, although as the court pointed out, his victims probably wished that he had been. Terry's victims were his ex-wife and son, and the record shows that he violated a restraining order when he committed this crime. And throughout the incarceration, Terry continued to threaten and contact them against their wishes. So the Georgia Supreme Court found that banishment to Toombs County had a rehabilitative purpose.
To be fair, it makes sense. Like, separate him away from her, put a large distance between the two of them.
And a protective purpose. The court said, quote, "It was Terry whose movements had to be curtailed, not hers, and a scheme that allowed her to move freely about most of the state without fear of Terry was appropriate." Now, these were some crazy criminal punishments, but that's just the half of it. There have been so many weird punishments doled out over the years that we couldn't fit them into this single video. So we made an exclusive companion video of even more bizarre criminal punishments, which you can only see if you sign up with today's sponsor.
Great video. I mean, initially, I went into this thinking we're going to see examples of judges like, losing their heads, acting out, getting emotional. But a lot of these punishments, I actually side with now. I'm in favor of these more creative punishments that are really sort of like tailored specific to the crimes, because it does seem like just sticking people in prison for 20, 30 years isn't really working. So these types of punishments where it's like super relevant to what they did, I think I'm in favor of. What do you guys think? Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.